I'm going to be talking about cold emails today, and I use the word cold loosely here because one thing I want to stress before we properly get started is that there are two ways that you can do a cold email. You can send one email to 10,000 recipients that you've managed to source, or you can highly personalize a cold email to one specific target. And it's the latter that I'll be talking about here. This isn't for people who have purchased a list and want to send an email to 10,000 different people. This isn't for people who have an email list of 1,000 prospects that they're hoping to target with one fell swoop. This is for people that want to engage with highly targeted outreach for, it could be prospective clients they want to work with, that they have specifically identified for various reasons. So that's the first thing to say about this. 95% of a good cold email is research. So the actual writing part, which I'm going to do on this call, is very, very quick. It should be very, very quick if you know what you're doing, and there's a formula that I'll share which will help you with that. If you know what you're doing, the actual writing part is quick. The hard part about making a good cold email is the research required to warm it up as much as possible. So when I say cold email, what I'm actually referring to is a warm email to someone who you haven't yet met. And what that means in practice is a huge amount of personalization, providing value to the recipient, and making it uniquely about them, by which I mean, I think possibly the most important takeaway from this entire call, and I'll start with it because, you know, it's good to kind of get the good stuff out early, is that the reasons why people don't open or click or reply to a cold email are because at some point during the process they figure out that the email that they're reading is not for them specifically. So I'll say that one more time. The only reason why someone wouldn't open or engage with or reply to your cold email is if they've realized that it's a cold email. And that can happen at various points during the cold email. It can happen with the subject line, for example. If the subject line is too generic, then your recipient isn't going to open it because they've already figured out that it's a cold email. Likewise, it could be that within the first couple of paragraphs, your recipient has realized that actually this is an email for everyone. Or it could even be at the very end that they realize, oh, actually, I think this email has been sent to 1,000 other people. And if that happens at any point, your recipient is highly unlikely to reply to you or do what you're asking them to do. So fundamentally, the best cold emails are the ones that don't read like a cold email. And that's probably the most important part of this entire call, is that what you want to do is, after you've written your cold email, read it back and think to yourself, could I send this to 50 other people and it would make sense for them? And if the answer is yes, it's probably not a very good cold email. And your response rate, your engagement rate, whatever you want to happen is going to be quite low. So that's what I'd say. In terms of some specific rules, so we've done our research, we know exactly who we're emailing, we have their first name, we have their job title, maybe we've stalked them on LinkedIn or something, and I'm not usually an advocate of stalking, Anita, but in the case of a cold email, the more stalking we can do, the better. We don't want to be creepy. We don't want to know too much about them. We shouldn't know, their boyfriend or girlfriend's name or their address or anything like that. We shouldn't be on their Facebook profile seeing what club they were at last week. But we might have a look at their LinkedIn, for example. That's a good way to do it because not only are you finding professional information out about them, but depending on their settings, it may be that you looking at their LinkedIn comes up as a notification for them. So they're already somewhat familiar with your name, which can be a great way to warm up any outreach that you do after that point. We want to know as much as possible about them. We don't want to weaponize that information in a creepy way. I should stress that. Let's start with the subject line. Once we've done our research, we want our subject line to be concise and personalized. And this is a principle that works whether you're doing e-commerce outreach, direct consumer outreach, or whether you're doing B2B outreach. The fundamentals of a good subject line remain the same. So concise, let's not make it too long. Personalized, if we can include a first name, there's evidence to suggest that subject lines that include a first name have a 50% increase in open rate, so it's an easy win if you've already got their first name. But we can go beyond that in terms of personalization. And when I do the example, I'll craft a way that we can be personal in the subject line to such an extent that it's not just the first name we're using, but we're referring to a specific piece of information that is unique to the recipient. First person is also a great rule of thumb, by which I mean we're using I rather than we. So if I'm cold outreaching someone, I'll be using I a lot. I won't be using we. I don't want to email on behalf of the Inbox Club as an agency voice. You know, we think you could be doing this, that, and the other. I want to be saying, I think this, that, and the other. And the reason for that is simple. It's because time and time again, evidence shows that people are more likely to buy from individuals than organizations. And this is something that organizations are starting to wake up to. It's the fact that there was a time where presenting yourself as an organization was the best way to look professional. You know, this is why freelancers turned themselves into agencies, pretended to be agencies, so that they could look kind of more official and legit. But what we're now seeing is a shift back towards an emphasis on the individual, which is why even huge corporations are trying to make superstars out of the people that work for them. They are encouraging their employees more and more to have their own personal brands because, like I say, evidence has showed that whether you're cold emailing someone or you're on the phone to someone, presenting yourself as an I rather than a we makes you more trustworthy in the eyes of the prospective customer. So we extend that principle into our cold emails as well. Another key principle that I want to stress before, and I'll start typing very shortly, is to be very low pressure. Now, there's lots of debate here about how high pressure you should be when it comes to how aggressive you are in your sales approach. For me, low pressure is best in terms of sales, but I think it's really important that we make it as easy as possible for the recipient to do what we want them to do. So I'll expand on this a little bit. Let's say that we are cold emailing someone and we sell furniture. Okay, so quite a high ticket item. You know, if you're buying a sofa, at least in England, you're probably spending about £1,000 a minimum these days. It would be silly to try and sell that sofa in the first email that we send someone, right? If we're cold emailing someone, getting them from opening their email, which in itself is an achievement with a cold email, to buying a sofa is incredibly difficult, and you're going to have a very, very low success rate. So we have to remember that this is top of the funnel stuff. We're nurturing them, we're getting a conversation with them so that we can later ask them for the big favor, whether that's buying a high ticket item, maybe it's filling out a 20 question questionnaire. You know, it would be silly to ask them to fill out a questionnaire that takes them, 30 minutes the first time we get in touch with them. But by initiating that conversation and starting with an easier, more frictionless CTA, we can then cultivate that relationship and get them to where we want them to be. So a real life example of this, and you'll have received plenty of these emails, I'm sure, Hanita, as will anyone who's watching this. We often get approached with cold emails that have something like, let's jump on a call at the end. Let's jump on a call. All I need is an hour of your time, and jump on a call and I'll explain how this all works. That's relatively low friction, but still an hour of your time is still quite a big ask of someone. So instead, if we must initiate a call, and I would encourage anyone watching this to really consider what exactly they want their recipient to do. But if it must be a call, try to make it as short as possible, maybe 15 minutes. You shouldn't need any longer than 15 minutes. And rather than putting the ball in the recipient's court and saying, what time are you free next week? Which, gives the recipient some work to do, because suddenly they've got to think about when they're free and they've got to check their diary, and, that's a pain. That's a pain for, we have to assume that our recipient is incredibly busy, doesn't really have time for these emails in the first place. So instead, name a specific time and date and ask them whether that time and date is good. So be specific with your CTA as well. We're not just asking them to jump on a 15-minute call. We're saying, come on this 15-minute call at 11:30 next Tuesday, and I'll explain. And suddenly that's much easier for the recipient. And if they're busy, maybe they'll let you know. But presenting a time and removing any sense of decision-making from them is incredibly important. And again, I'll demonstrate that in the cold email that I'll write here. Now, I thought it would be helpful to kind of write a cold email almost live on air, so to speak, and as I'm doing it, I'll talk through some of the principles that I'm employing here. So we'll start with the subject line. And when it comes to, and by the way, I'm going to write this from the perspective of, this is the kind of cold email that I would send someone as an email marketing agency owner. So that's the perspective that I'm doing it for. The principles that I'm using here can be applied to virtually every single industry going, although some industries might require a slightly more complex approach, but in general, this should work. So in terms of subject, so we already have the name. I'm just going to use your name if you don't mind, just for the purposes of this example. So we already have a name. I would start the subject line with the name just because it springs out a little bit more. We have to remember that the inbox that we're going to end up landing in is going to be, excuse me, is going to be incredibly busy, congested. So anything we can do to immediately catch the attention of our recipient, we should. Using a first name right off the bat is a good way to do that. And I also want to include something quite personal here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this. I didn't receive a welcome email. Now, the reason that I've chosen this is firstly because it immediately starts that principle of first person. So this isn't a we, this isn't I, this is one individual emailing another, and it also pertains to a specific problem that I've had as well. I didn't receive a welcome email. It could be a customer service email, for example, but it also, hopefully, by reading this, we're triggering something in the recipient's mind, which is our fictional Hanita here. We're triggering something in their mind, which is, oh, actually, yeah, I don't send welcome emails. So that's the outreach, the subject line that I'm using here, because it's highly personalized. If you do send welcome emails, this doesn't apply to you, and already you're going to know that this is cold outreach, and it's nonsense, and it's not for you. So again, that's why it comes down to this research. Sorry. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So the context here, for example, and this is a cold outreach tactic that I genuinely use, is that we will sometimes find companies that don't send out welcome emails. So you sign up for their newsletter and you don't get a welcome email. And then we'll email them and say, by the way, I didn't get one. And our response rate is over 80% with this email, by the way. I should have said that at the start. So it's, as you say, it's triggering some sort of curiosity, but it's also highly relevant to the recipient. We'll use their name. Now, there is some debate over whether you use hi or hey or just, the first name without anything like that. I think a hi is a safe bet. I don't think this requires too much analysis, but some people will use good morning or good afternoon or whatever. I think for the purposes of not necessarily knowing what time zone someone's in or something like that, or when indeed they're opening the email, it's better just to stick with hi. I'm not going to introduce myself here. One mistake that you often see with cold email outreach is that they'll spend 3 or 4 lines introducing yourself. My name is James, I run the Inbox Club agency, etc., etc., etc. There's no need for any of that. We can get to that maybe later on in the email, but we don't need to include it here. And the reason for that comes back to that fundamental point I made at the start. We don't want this to appear to be an email that's being sent to tens or potentially hundreds of people. Instead, we want it to read as though it is highly personalized to them. So instead, I would start with something like this. I've signed up, you'll have to excuse my typos. I've signed up to your mailing list, but I noticed I didn't receive a welcome email. Right, so again, this is highly personalized. I've now established the fact that I have engaged with this fictional company in some respect. It might be that instead of your, I put the company will just use Maple's. I'm sure Mayple has an excellent welcome email, but just for the sake of this example, I've signed up to Maple's mailing list, but I noticed I didn't receive a welcome email. So that's a fantastic way to open, because the recipient here is reading this thinking, okay, this person is emailing me specifically. They're not emailing this to 1,000 different people. And there's also an element of concern here as well. There's some curiosity that's perhaps elicited by the fact that there wasn't a welcome email sent out. Maybe the recipient knows that there isn't a welcome email being sent out, but more often than not, it catches the recipient by surprise. they think that a welcome email is going out, but actually they forgot to activate it, or it's still sat in their draft somewhere. So it can be quite interesting to them. At this point, I want to provide some value. So there's an important point to be made here about value, which is that what I like to do with my cold emails is to ensure that the recipient doesn't regret opening them. Even if they're not going to reply to me, even if they ignore it, they learn something from it that they can take away. And I think that's a really nice principle to adhere to, because by internalizing that principle, it automatically makes you less spammy, because you're trying to give them some value regardless of whether they actually reply to you or engage. So I would say something like, and this is true by the way, did you know that welcome emails are opened on average 4 times more than an average campaign? So this is providing some value in that it's sharing an interesting fact about welcome emails. But the other advantage that I like about this is that it is, are you still there, by the way, Henny? So I'm just aware that, oh, you are, excellent, cool. The other thing that I really like about this is that we're kind of selling the service already, right? So we're demonstrating why you should have a welcome email, which is going to feed very nicely into the CTA that I'm going to present here. By the way, throughout this whole process, we can add little bits of personalization and personality if we want. So for example, after list here, I could put, I can't wait to read your emails, or something like that. Now, some people might find that cheesy. It's not for everyone. But again, just finding these opportunities to insert these little bits of personalization can be really, really good. I'll talk about that in a bit later on as well. So that's a pretty strong opening line. We're using the first person. It's highly personalized, and we're demonstrating some value and why we could potentially be useful. We're also, I suppose, on a more subtle level, positioning ourselves as authorities when it comes to emailing as well, which can be helpful. And we'll consolidate on that now. So this is where I would possibly start to introduce myself a bit. And I'm not going to go into my, what grades I got in school or anything like that. But a brief acknowledgement of what I do is important, because obviously if we don't establish ourselves as authorities, then we could just be anyone. So I'm gonna ask the question, and then I'm gonna quickly introduce myself. So something like this, I would say, would you like me to write you one? Nothing too sophisticated about this whatsoever. And here's where I introduce myself. I run an email marketing agency, and our welcome emails have been read by over 10 million recipients. So I've had plenty of practice, something like that. So what I like about this is that this is where the introduction comes in. Look, not at the top here. If we opened with this line, we would lose our reader. I'm fairly confident our reader would at that point switch over to something more important. We're putting it in, firstly, after we've presented the proposition, the whole point of the email. So the aim of this cold email is that we want to write them a welcome email draft, send it to them totally for free, in the hope that that will start a conversation that can lead to a more meaningful relationship with this prospective client. This is where we position ourselves as authorities. Again, I haven't gone into too much depth. It's one sentence. It's not a full paragraph. It's not my CV or resume, whatever you want to call it. Instead, it's a quick acknowledgement. I run an email marketing agency. Some evidence and a stats-based evidence is always the best sort of evidence for something like this. So our welcome emails have been read by over 10 million recipients, so I've had plenty of practice, and that's it. And then we go back. And here comes the CTA, and I said to you at the start, Hanita, that you should always keep your cold emails concise. Again, we have to assume that our recipient is incredibly busy. So here's the CTA. If this sounds interesting, I might put for free here, just to reassure them. Again, we're preempting this idea that our recipient is going to have doubts, right? They're going to be highly, highly cynical of what we're writing here. So where possible, preempting those doubts is fantastic practice. It strikes me that our recipient is probably thinking, how much is this going to cost me? So by putting for free in straight away, it just reassures them that, no, okay, they're not after my money here. So, what are they after? Here comes the CTA. If this sounds interesting, reply to this email with the word yes, and I'll send it in 3 days. Send it over. Let's just make it a little less formal. I'll send it over in 3 days. Right, so I'll just talk about this sentence very, very quickly. This is very low pressure. If this sounds interesting, posits the idea that it might not be interesting to them. Perhaps they already have a welcome email that they just need to click activate on, in which case, no problem at all. Some people will go quite a long way in making sure that they're not pressurizing their recipient. So they might say, for example, there's absolutely no pressure. If you've already got a welcome email, just ignore this, etc. And we can do that. In my opinion, that's sort of a given anyway. You know, obviously there's no pressure for them to reply. And obviously there's no obligation or kind of moral duty for them to reply. So pointing that out, I think, is a little bit needless and basically just wastes words. Remember, the whole idea of this is that we're getting to the heart of what we want as quickly as possible. In terms of the CTA itself, reply to this email with the word yes, and I'll send it over in 3 days. You'll notice that this is highly, highly specific. So I'm not asking much of the recipient here. I'm not asking them to fill out a questionnaire. I'm not asking them to tell me all about their email marketing woes. I'm not asking them to purchase a monthly retainer off us or anything like that. All I'm asking is for them to click reply and type the word yes and click send. It takes 5 seconds. And that's incredibly important. We're trying to make this as frictionless as possible for our recipient to do what we want them to do. I've also put, I'll send it over in 3 days. That's to give them this sense of tangibility as well. If you just put, I'll send it over, that's absolutely fine, but it's ambiguous. It leaves it sort of open-ended. You know, am I going to get this in 2 weeks or immediately? Send it over. It doesn't really matter how long it takes you. It could be 3 weeks. But saying something specific and managing their expectations is a great way, again, to reduce that friction. It reduces any doubts in their mind that this is a legitimate practice. So if this sounds interesting, reply to this email with the word yes, and I'll send it over in 3 days. And that's it, pretty much. Then I might put something like, thanks, James. Very informal. If possible, I'm not going to use my email signature here, with my fancy graphics. I'm not going to have any special design either, by the way. This is how I want the email to look in the inbox. I want it to look plain. I want it to look like a friend has sent it, Your parents or your friends don't send you fancy, beautifully designed emails with buttons and, templates, borders and images and that sort of thing. They send you plain text emails, right? Like boring text on a white background emails. And that's what I want our email to look like as well. I want it to look as uninvasive and uncorporate as possible. Thanks, James. One little hack that I really like to include at the end of every cold email is a PS. PSs are underrated, in my opinion. They are usually the sentiment, they usually define the sentiment that the recipient comes away with. So a good PS can make or break a cold outreach email, in my opinion. And the PS, I think, should be highly personalized. And this is where our LinkedIn stalking comes in. If we can find anything that we have in common with this person, we should use it here, okay? And there's an argument to be said that you can use it earlier. For example, you could have preview text, which is the sort of email tagline that comes after the subject that you'll see displayed in your inbox. We could have preview text that says, by the way, I see that we both went to the same university or something like that. I don't know, like that's a terrible example, but you get the idea. Finding something that kind of links you both is a fantastic way to end an email, and it reinforces this idea that this email could only be sent to this particular person. So, we might put something like, I saw that you were at the Web Summit conference in Lisbon last week. So was I. How nice is Lisbon? I don't know. Not the best example, again, maybe that's a little bit too stalkery, but you get the idea. We're trying to find some sort of bond here. Now, if you read back this email, you'll notice a couple of things. Firstly, it's incredibly unsophisticated, right? There's nothing that I've done that's particularly magical. There's no sorcery involved here. It's probably, let's see how many words it is. I would imagine that it's, 113 words. It's incredibly short. However, it includes all the elements that we'd want to see from a good cold outreach email. It starts with some personalization. It continues with a specific problem and a reason why that's a problem with some authoritative-based evidence. Here's our question, and then here's our kind of social proof. This is our evidence that we can actually deliver what we're offering. And here's our CTA, and it's incredibly specific, easy to execute, frictionless for the recipient. Informal, and then with a little PS, it just adds that extra little bit of personalization. So you see here that we cannot send this email to another 50 people. It would make no sense to them. You know, not every one of those 50 is going to be at the Web Summit. Not every one of those 50 is not going to be sending a welcome email, for example. So highly personalized, very, very well researched. You can send, 10, 20 of these a day if you have a good sort of pipeline for doing this research. And your results will be significantly better than sending 500 emails, generic emails out to everyone, I promise you. Yeah, that kind of concludes my writing up. Would love to hear any questions that you might have.